Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Foote. I'm lecturer in 19th century art at Edinburgh University. And I would like to start by thanking Michael and Scott for their invitations to contribute to this first seminar on the Scottish Revival Network programme. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion event taking place in a few weeks. So what I'm going to do today is talk about spiritualism in Celtic Revival art, so look more broadly at the context of this, as well as looking at a specific artwork. So by the mid-1890s, Ramsay Lodge in Edinburgh's Old Town was the heart of Patrick Geddes' Renaissance. There, revivalists gathered at summer meetings with a view of regenerating Scottish society, from improving the slums of the Old Town to revitalising the arts. For visual artists such as John Duncan, Celticism became central to the project of revival. Drawing on Celtic motifs such as knotwork, boring antiquary and archaeological discoveries that were classified as Celtic, and depicting subject matter that reflected episodes of Celtic mythology and folklore. There were also poignant examples of deliberate attempts to evoke Scotland's past, whether historic, imagined, or mythologized. It is this connection with the past as a basis for revivalism that I want to explore in more detail by unpicking nuances that link Celtic revivalist efforts with spiritualist interests. To do that, I want to look at a case study of a mural that was found in the common room at Ramsay Lodge and its place in the wider context of spiritualism. Used by university students, Geddes and his visitors for the summer meetings, the common room was a space intended to intellectualize, inspire, debate, and discuss the ideas and intentions of Renaissance. Sometime before 1898, Geddes had John Duncan paint murals in the common room. There were two strains, one which focused on ancient Celtic myth and legend, and the other on inspirational biographical paintings of historic Scottish figures. The scenes of Celtic myths were based on the Ossianic cycle and followed themes of regeneration, such as the awakening of the hero Cuchulainn from the spell of sleep, symbolic of rebirth. Liz Cumming considered that these murals show that Geddes and his artists forged an alternative art for Scotland, built on a surge of romantic nationalism. Meanwhile, the historic figures, their names listed here, represented important Scots from the medieval and Renaissance periods. However, more modern figures would be added to later murals in the 1920s. Duncan Macmillan saw these murals as one of the pageants of history that Geddes was so fond of, and one which stressed two things in particular: the Scottish scientific tradition and the role of Scots in Europe. And John Morrison has argued the murals emphasise Scotland's internationalism as well as its individuality. The mural I want to focus on is one of the biographical paintings of Michael Scott. And I should apologise now for the poor quality image. It's actually quite difficult to get good images of the murals. Michael Scott, born in the Scottish borders, lived between circa 1175 and 1232. He was a Renaissance man before his time, a scholar, doctor, translator, philosopher, and mathematician. He was also an alchemist and court astrologer to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. His reputation was embellished over the centuries, and his legend gained occultized qualities. In his Divine Comedy, Dante turned Scott into a sorcerer and placed him in the 8th circle of hell. James Hogg and Walter Scott both saw him as a magician and wizard respectively. Fantastical stories about his life abound. Apparently spirits would wait dishes during his feasts. He could cleft hills apart. And, as illustrated in the mural, he rode from Scotland to Paris in one night, sent as the King of Scotland's ambassador to the French king. His black steed was in fact a daemon familiar, capable of flying over the English Channel under the wizard's command. This narrative also alludes to another Celtic revival theme in the Franco-Scottish relations, the two countries sharing claims to Celtic ancestry. However, central to the mural is a portrait of Michael Scott with Aristotle leaning over him. Scott, the real man, had learned Arabic to study the Arabic texts on Aristotle, which he translated into Latin. The translation is the main focus of this image, and there are symbolic resonances that speak to a number of key points. Firstly, the intellectual accomplishments of the Scots on an international stage. Secondly, revival of lost interpretations, at least what Europeans might consider lost until translated. And thirdly, the connection between the ancient past, medieval past, and modern present. The latter is conveyed with the use of a peculiar spiritualist iconography that centers on the spirit working with a medium. To explain this, I want to take a big step back now and look at the broader context so we can look at this mural again as informed viewers. Modern spiritualism, a spiritual movement originating in America from the middle of the 19th century, coincided with the Celtic revival. Spiritualism had an international reach in its heyday, spreading from America to Australia, from Scotland to South Africa. Its central belief was that life continued after death, and that it was possible to contact the spirits of the dead. Contact usually took place at seances through the aid of spirit mediums, people who claimed to have a sensitivity to spirit communication. The spirits traversed the veil, a border between the spirit realm and the mortal world, to pass on messages from the other side. Such messages could be of comfort to the bereaved on a personal level, but more importantly, according to the movement, seance messages were ideologically intended to improve humankind and society through the guidance of spirit lessons. The aim was spiritual apotheosis and transcendence through the realms or planes of spirit world, known as Summerland. Summerland therefore represented a spiritual idyll, a utopia that society could strive for. This utopian current became attractive to idealists towards the end of the century, and may have been attractive to figures such as Patrick Geddes and members of the Edinburgh Social Union. However, I'm not going to focus on the utopian aspects per se here. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that spiritualism itself was a proponent of revivalism. It focused on social reform through spiritual renewal and improvement. Spiritualists sought to revive a return to the spiritual in the modern world, rejecting materialism as its antithesis. The belief that it was possible to make contact with the spirit realm offered interesting conceptual opportunities. For example, spiritualists believed that they could directly contact or directly connect with the spirits of the past. I want to focus on that perceived connection with the past as a core theme for revivalism. I'll explore this by first looking briefly at spiritualist interests in Scottish cultural identity that secured a way of thinking about Scotland and the Scots in enchanted terms, which seemed to synthesize with Celtic revivalist ideas. Despite spiritualism originating in America and being known as an Anglo-American movement, Scots made significant contributions to spiritualism as mediums, as advocates, as patrons, and as psychical researchers, that is, scientific investigators of spirit phenomena. Now, I'm not going to list all of them here for time's sake, but suffice to say, generation of Scots made their mark on the movement. The two Scots who were foremost amongst the pantheon of spiritualist champions were Daniel Douglas Hume and, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle. Hume was born in Curry outside Edinburgh. He was known as a powerful medium who took spiritualism into the royal courts of Europe, giving seance demonstrations to the heads of state. He also attempted to convince the Pope on one occasion, but his efforts didn't quite go to plan, and he was chased from Rome as a necromancer. Nonetheless, so prestigious was his career as a spirit medium that he became known as the St. John the Baptist of spiritualism. Arthur Conan Doyle doesn't need an introduction, but as a convinced spiritualist, he advocated for modern spiritualism, going on international propaganda tours for the movement. He authored spiritualist literature. He held numerous presidencies of spiritualist associations and psychical research societies, and represented spiritualism as its spokesperson at dozens of conferences. Whereas Hume was known by contemporaries as the St. John the Baptist, Conan Doyle was called the St. Paul of spiritualism. With Scots playing a significant and prominent role in the movement, this was noted very early on in the movement's development and inevitably resulted in their fellow spiritualists turning to Scotland and asking why was this the case. Hume flamboyantly offered the answers. Although he was born in Curry, he actually emigrated to America at the age of 4 and grew up in the state of Connecticut, where he allegedly mastered his mediumistic powers. Despite this, he was adamant that he was Scottish and deliberately presented himself as such, as we see here in this studio photograph where he poses in Highland regalia and all that. His mother, Betsy Hume, maiden name MacNeil, claimed to descend from a line of Highland seers, and Hume made much of his ancestral powers of second sight, which he said accounted for his own mediumistic powers of vision and clairvoyance, his ability to see spirits. Hume embodied a personal revival, returning to his origins in Scotland, to his past, to find a spiritual identity as a medium that was heightened by his cultural associations of being Scottish. Hume was not the only spiritualist to do this. Numerous mediums attempted to claim a connection with Scotland, some more convincingly than others. The English medium, William Eglinton, also claimed an ancestral lineage to the Highland seers through his mother's line. Meanwhile, Cora Tappan Richmond, a charismatic American medium and founder of the US National Spiritualist Association, claimed during a tour of Scotland in the 1870s that she had been named after Cora Lynn in the Falls of Clyde. Her maiden name was Scott, and I'll give you 3 guesses which famous literary figure she claimed to be a distant relation of. Marie Sinclair, English-born and from Spanish descent, gained her Scottish title through marriage to become the Countess of Caithness. She claimed that while being situated in the landscape of Scotland, either in its Highland glens or in the ruins of Holyrood Kirk, she would encounter visions of Mary, Queen of Scots, who would become Sinclair's spirit guide throughout her long career as an occultist. Apparently, the spirits of Scotland's past were very busy indeed contacting spiritualists. Mary, Queen of Scots, William Wallace, Robert Bruce, Rabbie Burns, Walter Scott, Macbeth, and even John Knox would make frequent visits and seances, according to spiritualist accounts. Burns' night seances could be a riot when they would all turn up at once, but I'm afraid I don't have time to outline that account right now. Spiritualists tapped into prevalent themes of romanticism that were well established across Victorian society, and particularly notions of Highlandism. The landscape of Scotland became closely associated with the development of mediumistic powers that were central to the operations and beliefs of spiritualists. The Scottish mountains in particular were seen as the spiritual, if romantic, setting which gave rise to a people who were empowered by their landscape. As one spiritualist, James Martin Peebles, claimed in his book, Seers of the Ages, Embracing Spiritualism Past and Present, the rustic people, especially the Highlanders of Scotland, have ever been celebrated for their gifts of second sight, clairvoyance. As gardens and flowers tend to the cultivation of the beautiful, so mountainous regions to the development of the spiritual. Such a theory encouraged the belief that Scotland was important to nurture spiritualistic powers and increase mediumistic sensitivity. The argument sought to show a connection between an ancient form of mediumship, second sight, and modern mediumistic phenomena, clairvoyance. Spiritualist interpretations of Scottish mediumship paralleled the Arnoldian discourse on Celtic sensitivity. In 1867, Matthew Arnold wrote his influential discourse on the study of Celtic literature. Arnold associated the Celts with a powerful sensitivity to nature, to sentimentality, and by extension to spirituality. According to Arnold, the Celt's sensibility gives him a peculiarly near and intimate feeling of nature. He seems in a special way attracted by the secret before him, the secret of natural beauty and natural magic, to be close to it, to half divine it. Spiritualist interpretations of this notion suggested that the Celt was inherently susceptible to the secrets of nature. Attuning to natural magic made the Celts particularly good spirit mediums as intermediates between this world and the next. As Alex Owen has demonstrated, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the majority of mediums were women, and their feminine sensitivity was deemed important for their role. Male mediums were therefore often regarded to have a certain feminine quality when they successfully fulfilled the role usually dominated by women. The assignment of femininity was thought to be a positive attribute in the spiritualist movement because it allowed for optimum sensitivity to the spirit world. Therefore, whilst Arnold argued that Celtic sensitivity was peculiarly feminine, when spiritualist men did particularly well in their mediumistic role, they were associated with the typically Celtic trait of feminine sensitivity, such as in the case of Daniel Douglas Hume and William Egerton, both taking after their Highland mothers. This characterizing sensitivity was thought to make the Celt prone to emotionalism, directly in contrast to rationalism. The conflict between Enlightenment rationalism and natural magic and sensitivity provided a framework that separated the English from their Celtic neighbours. It also revealed another mode of difference, whereby the English had become disenchanted while the Celts remained enchanted. Or perhaps, as far as the Celtic revival was concerned, the Celts could achieve re-enchantment. As spiritualists recognised the significance of Scottish involvement in their movement, spiritualism called to protect the Celtic qualities of the Scots. Concerns were raised that as Scots became more like the materialistic and rational thinking character of their stolid English neighbours, they risked losing their innate sensitivity to the natural phenomena of spirit contact. Indeed, the loss of their Celtic temperament was also a loss of their inherent identity. As a spiritualist newspaper wrote, "The tendency has been to dim the spiritual and overshadow it with that which is purely physical. The enlightenment at the last generation has been altogether of a utilitarian kind. Hence, the hard-headed, educated Scot of today is a sceptic. In some respects, the Scotchman is on the decline, and with a materialistic education, a flippant, sceptical philosophy, and a worldly aspiration, he would soon degenerate into abject sensuality and moral sordidness." Enchantment gave Scots the sensitivity to attune to natural magic, and Celtic re-enchantment offered a connection to the magic of the past. The past is referenced everywhere in the Celtic revival, not only in the artworks, but also in the organised pageants where historic figures, real or legendary, return to the present. This was sort of like the processions of spirits on parade in séance parlours. Similarly, the cyclical element of the Evergreen magazine, with its volumes marked by seasons, symbolically suggests what was will come again, the past will find a way into the present. With spiritualism offering to bridge the past with the present, it is little surprise then that Celtic revivalists reciprocated interest in spiritualism. Professor John Stuart Blackie, who was influential in founding the Chair of Celtic Studies at Edinburgh University, regularly attended séances in the 1870s and 80s, first under investigation or as member of an investigative group, but later he continued to pursue it on a personal basis. Not necessarily believing it, but certainly engaging with it. Andrew Lang was a member and president of the Society of Psychical Research and made numerous studies of spiritualism, showing a deep-level engagement with the movement, although he was careful to keep his cards to his chest about what he really thought of it. Patrick Geddes and his colleague John Arthur Thompson were also acquainted with spiritualists and occultists. I mean, Annie Besant would probably be the most obvious example. But this also included connections with many of the scientists who had joined the ranks of spiritualism, such as Alfred Russel Wallace, who also proposed a theory of evolution, William Fletcher Barrett, and Oliver Lodge. Celtic Revival poet William Sharp, writing under the pseudonym of Fiona MacLeod, has called into question how the identity of MacLeod could be understood in his work. Generally, it has been agreed that MacLeod was not a mere pen name. One of the many interpretations suggests that Sharp used MacLeod as an outlet for his peculiarly feminine but overtly Celtic sentiments and emotions. Interestingly, Maureen Martin has pointed out that Sharp insisted MacLeod was a female spirit who spoke through him, suggesting a spiritualistic explanation of MacLeod as a spirit guide working through Sharp, the medium. Sharp's wife, Elizabeth, wrote in her memoirs of her husband that he was a psychic child and had visions when he was young. And in one of his poems to her, titled Indian Cemetery, a note accompanying one of the verses claimed, "There are spirits everywhere. We are never alone, though we are rarely conscious of other presences." So it seems that Sharp attracts commentary that alludes to his mediumistic abilities to be aware of spirits around him. Michael Shaw has shown how John Duncan was interested in theosophy, but Duncan was interested in spiritualism too. Writing in his notebooks, he reveals his interests. "I have always been suspicious of unconscious art activity. I imagine it was mostly like offering oneself as a medium to any spirit who happened to come along." He uses spiritualist language here, demonstrating a familiarity with the movement. The idea that one might subject oneself to spirit control is not actually as disparaging as it first appears. The issue was with any spirit, but not the right spirit. Duncan believed he had his own spirit guide, and with that spirit he was content to commune. Duncan claimed she was of indescribable beauty, and her perceived presence overwhelmed Duncan upon her first appearance to him. He wrote a short account of her spirit visitation in his notebook. "She glowed with deep jewel life. Her poise was perfect. The expression of the eyes cannot be described. They were kind and comprehending, but there was no weakness in them. They warmed and strengthened me." Duncan seems enchanted by his spirit guide, or the idea of her at least. Duncan manifests his awareness of spiritualism and the concept of spirit guides in the murals at Ramsay Lodge. For example, to some extent, this is evident in The Taking of Excalibur, where a young Arthur, an exceptional mortal, but a mortal nonetheless, is guided to his spiritual destiny by the elderly wizard Merlin, who has associations with the Fae and Otherworld. Merlin is Arthur's spirit guide and represents an older age passing its wisdom to the next generation. The past assists the future. In the mural of Michael Scott, another revered wizard of sorts, the passage of wisdom moves from the spirits of the past, from the ancient Greek philosopher to the medieval Scottish scholar, and then onto the original mortal viewers, the Victorian students using the common room for their studies. Michael Scott is literally the medium during the act of translation that is depicted in the mural. But on a metaphysical level, he is also the medium for the spirit of Aristotle. The way Aristotle connects with Scott implies he has taken control, like a spirit takes control of the medium. He places his hand on Scott's and the other on his shoulder, and stares intently on Scott's head, suggesting a mesmerization of the brain. Scott's face, although frowning, has vacant, passive eyes, as though he has entered a trance. Only his hand is in action, automatically writing under Aristotle's control. The features of this mural parallel the theories of spiritualists and their illustrations to explain the workings of spirit guides, such as the example here. The medium, the woman in this case, has a vacant stare while automatically writing. She doesn't look down at what she's doing. The spirit guide, floating above her, holds her hands above both the medium and the seance sitter's heads, with faint lines projecting from her fingers to their skulls to show her mesmerizing the pair and working through the medium, a bit like a puppet master. In this case, the seance sitter places his hand on the medium's, but the concept is much the same in the mural. To further visualize the spirit guide's presence and to ensure the viewer recognize the spiritualist tropes employed to give meaning to the mural, Duncan used spirit photography to inform the composition. Spirit photography had entered popular culture by the end of the 19th century, being either a curiosity for dabblers or a serious practice for spiritualists, but either way, a fairly well-known type of imagery. The photographer would take a photograph of the sitter, and when the photographic plate was developed, the presence of a spirit would be revealed, such as the examples by William Mumler on the screen here. Often the spirit would place a comforting arm around the sitter's shoulder, much like the presence of Aristotle behind Michael Scott. Duncan used these spiritualist features to heighten the perception of Scott's spiritual and indeed occult powers. Here he channels the spirit of Aristotle to gain access to ancient philosophies and wisdom. Duncan deliberately depicted Michael Scott in such a way that places him in the context of spiritualist practices. Geddes was most likely drawn to Scott not only because of his intellectual accomplishments, but because he had a reputation as a wizard as well. In his interpretation of the murals, Geddes noted Scott's work included astrology, alchemy, and the occult sciences. Spiritualism and psychical research were counted amongst the occult sciences in the Victorian period. So 19th century occult sciences blended both inquiry and re-enchantment, and in the context here satisfied the Celtic propensity for natural magic and spiritual progress. Progress that had the advantage of ancient wisdom gained by connecting with and reviving the past. There's much more that I could say here, but I'm very conscious of time, so I'll stop. But I would welcome any questions you might have at the live discussion event. And until then, thank you so much for listening.